Chenian and Khanjian focused on the role of institutions and development in Armenia, while Rufai discussed the prospects and challenges to economic growth. In order to discuss these issues, I'm going to use a recently published book by Darwin Acemoglu, the most famous Armenian economist, who is a professor at MIT, and James Robinson, called Why Nations Fail. It has 500 pages with full of historical examples of failed and successful nations, such as Mayas in Central America, Venice in Europe, Industrial Revolution in England, Soviet Union, South and North Korea, etc., etc. It is a friendly book, written for everyone. You don't need to be an economist to enjoy the book. They are basically arguing that nations will fail if they adopt extractive political and economic institutions, and will succeed if they adopt inclusive political and economic institutions. In order to have a sustainable economic growth and prosperity, inclusive economic and political institutions are necessary. Extractive political institutions imply that the political power of the country is concentrated in the hands of a few people. In other words, there is some kind of dictatorship or oligarchy. Also, extractive political institutions imply that the law doesn't apply to everyone, and especially the ruling class of the country. Inclusive political institutions imply that political power is shared by a large number of citizens, and there are limits to that. Inclusive political institutions imply that there is rule of law in the country, and there are no privileged small number of people who are above the law. In other words, as Chenian discussed in his paper, there is pluralism. In order to have inclusive political institutions, we need to have pluralism. Extractive economic institutions imply the existence of large monopolies and the extreme unequal distribution of wealth and income, with few very rich people and large number of poor. While inclusive economic institutions imply competitive markets without monopolies, without extreme unequal distribution, and without arbitrary taxation, with property rights, contract enforcement, and ease of starting new companies. Inclusive institutions are essential for the long-run economic development of a country because they give incentive to everyone to invest in the future. They generate an environment for investment, innovation, and trade. If the people will not be able to keep reasonable amount of the benefit of their innovation or business, they will have little incentive to innovate. Extractive economic institutions go with extractive political institutions. In order to maintain monopolies and control large part of national wealth and income, while the majority of the people live in poverty, the small number of monopolists and very rich need to have the political control of the country. The authors, Acemoglu and Robinson, provide many examples where countries with extractive political and economic institutions fail. A country with extractive institutions could achieve economic growth for some time, such as former Soviet Union republics. But eventually its economy will stagnate and fail. The authors predict that China's rapid economic growth will slow down and stagnate unless they introduce inclusive institutions. When I get the book, as usual, first, as Professor Vanisian mentioned, first I looked at the index to find out if Armenia was listed. I was glad when I saw Armenia, even though there was only one entry. I immediately found out the page where Armenia was mentioned and started to read. In those pages, the authors are analyzing Uzbekistan, which has highly extractive institutions and the same president since 1991. At the end of the page, the authors say that Uzbekistan, quote, has many commonalities with other former Soviet socialist republics, ranging from Armenia and Azerbaijan to Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan. This implies that the authors consider Armenia as a country with extractive institutions. Chenian also argues that Armenian politics is not based on pluralism. In other words, there is lack of inclusive institutions. He presents state-building elements and determining variables of state development, such as government legitimacy and equitable distribution of wealth. These elements that Chenian discusses would increase the inclusiveness of Armenia's institutions, which would contribute to the economic development of the country. In this sense, the concepts and political elements that Chenian discusses in his paper are very important, and there is need for their detailed analysis and development. I hope Chenian will continue studying and developing these concepts. In Armenia, if Armenia has extractive institutions, then according to Acemoglu and Robinson, the economic growth or the increase in per capita GDP that Julfayan showed us could be temporary, and that eventually could start to stagnate. Acemoglu and Robinson allocate a chapter on vicious cycle and a chapter for virtuous cycle. A country experiences vicious cycle if it has some extractive political and economic institutions and gradually moves towards extreme extractive institutions. While virtuous cycle implies that the country has some inclusive political and economic institutions and it gradually moves towards complete inclusive institutions. My impression is that Armenia has some extractive political and economic institutions and has some inclusive institutions. Then, the important question is, during the past 5 or 10 years, is Armenia experiencing a vicious cycle or a virtuous cycle? If Armenia is experiencing a vicious cycle, how could we reverse it? Acemoglu and Robinson showed that it is possible to reverse a vicious cycle. If pluralism and inclusive institutions play such an important role in the economic growth and development of a country, then what should we, the Armenian people in Armenia and the diaspora, do in order to develop inclusive political and economic institutions in Armenia, which could lead to sustainable economic growth and generate a prosperous democratic country? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Khanjian. At this time, Mr. Mark Chenian. Again, Mr. Chenian is the Vice President at UBS Financial Services. After Mr. Chenian's discussion, we would open the floor up to question and answer. I would ask at that time that the speakers and the discussants all join at the table so we can have a lively discussion section. Thank you.
Thank you. In assessing the first 20 years of the Republic of Armenia, the focus of this meeting panel, one cannot help but think of the phenomenon of failure, that is, the inability to cope with the new challenges and the new realities in the country. Today we are witnessing the unfolding of this continuous failure, a malaise that can be described as a crisis of confidence and will. Failure is not pleasant words to hear at any time, including at this conference. But how else one can explain, 20 years later, the discussion is still focused on fundamental issues like democracy, institutions, civil society, Dr. Kyrgyzstan's focus, and education, Dr. Julfayan's focus. There is no doubt that the collapse of the Soviet Union caught most by surprise. No one was prepared for it, including Armenians in Armenia and the diaspora. I believe that the unpreparedness and the big rush, both from Armenia and diaspora, to create on paper a facade of a republic, without the benefit of deep thinking, the domain of the think tanks, which Dr. Chenian mentioned, referred to, is a major contributing factor for this failure. Primarily because of this prevailing atmosphere in Armenia, the country deprived itself from the process of experiencing the development, which Dr. Chenian's papers basically was centered on. It is ironic that the collapse of the Union is in a way legitimized and therefore allowed the matrix, the model of personalized power that was reflected in the Constitution, which was addressed by Dr. Chenian. By the way, I'm cutting a lot because of the time shortage, but I want to bring out the
Thank you.
There is no doubt that the system has failed. Now this begs the question, what is the system? Based on observations of worldwide experiences, the ideal is the integration of the three doctrines, democracy, capitalism/market economy, and human rights, the fundamental components of the constitutions and the essentials of rule of law. The integration has in it built-in checks and balances that constitutions usually address. The three papers presented this morning address fundamental missing parts of this integration. This failure in fundamentals translates as a national security issue. Armenia cannot afford to weaken her national security requirements. For example, just a small footnote for people to know what I'm really talking about. According to reliable sources from armed forces in Armenia, Armenia needs for its security needs a head count of about 67,000 people. According to estimates, statistical estimates, this year and next year, the number of boys that will turn 18 is about 17,000. If 100% of these 17,000 go into the armed forces, that's a total of 34. Quite a lower number than the 67 that armed forces elites do think that Armenia needs. Just food for thought. Developments around the world during the past 2 years did demonstrate that there is a quantum change out there. In the past, there was a general frustration with the failure of the systems. What is new is the unacceptability of the failure of these systems. As a result, witness what's happening in the Middle East, Europe, including Russia. Armenia cannot be immune from these waves. And then I'm going to do some highlights here and finish in 1 minute. The trend towards Armenia becoming a city-state of Yerevan, almost totally ignoring the rest of the country, is a dangerous one. As Dr. Khanjian has written, there is a disconnect between the elite and the rest of the population. There is non-existence of the social contract that she talked about. Interest of individual versus interest of society is a fundamental issue in Armenia, and quite a few papers, 3 papers basically address it. It is true that the future is in the hands of new generation, but will the new generation be there when it's needed? That's a major issue in my mind. And the other part, which was again mentioned, the culture of capital formation is absolutely absent in Armenia. And if need be, we can elaborate on that. And this may be a little bit critical of what so far I said, but I have participated in at least 4 conferences, more or less titled 20 years later after the fall of the Soviet Union. One at UCLA, 3 others in Europe, and so forth. And the picture that just described here is not too much different from what Russian scholars are talking about Russia, Ukrainian scholars are talking about Ukraine, and so on and so forth. So basically, this is the general picture out there. And as always, it's the most dangerous position to be just before lunch. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
floor up to questions, a question and answer session. However, before we do that, I would like to ask the speakers and the discussants. The discussants can stay up here as well. I would like to ask if you have any questions from the speakers, or if the speakers have any questions pertaining to the discussants portion of the program.